It's time for us to check back in with the family history and stories of Opal Corn Myers. If you missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. There's also a link in the description for a place where you can go and buy this wonderful, wonderful book. Mary Ellison's wedding. Mama's cousin, Lewis Clark, you know, the Baptist preacher they called Travelin' Toe, would stop in at the chapel house most every Sunday. He was still walking and still preaching 3 or 4 times every Sunday. First at Shady Grove, then Bridgeport, and finishing up at West Myers that night. When he stopped at the mission, Mrs. Henderson would always have a cup of coffee and a piece of cake or something for him to eat. Usually Uncle Lewis's mind would be on his preaching, and I guess he never would take any time to eat unless someone sat him down and put it in front of him. He was the only Clark who lived right around here, but there were dozens of them living in Slabtown. I always enjoyed hearing him talk about all the things that the Lord is a-doing. Sometimes he would tell us about a funeral or a wedding, and you can be sure that ever since the days of stormy weather, Minner and Gimmer, and of course Victoria Hall and Reagan Jennings, I especially liked hearing about the weddings. They were my first weddings ever, and I would never forget them. Most of the people around these parts just slipped off to get married because public weddings sometimes still cause too much celebrating and foolishness. The first home wedding that I ever knew about was when my Aunt Martha married Isaac Crum. I was there, but that was probably back around 1913, so I was too young to remember much. We children were most likely outside playing and didn't even know what was going on. We had never heard of church weddings other than what we might read in a newspaper or magazine at the chapel house. The only church wedding I ever saw until after I was grown and married was Mary Ellison's, Clark's sister. The chapel women gave Mary a wedding that was not to be forgotten by anyone, and I was so excited that I was there to help. We spent hours upon hours making all kinds of decorations and food. The day before the wedding, the chapel women gave us an infare supper for Mary and Carl's parents and all those who were in their wedding. Miss Martson called a reception an infare, a word we had never heard before, but then not that many had ever heard of a reception. The day of the wedding, we got up early and spent all morning fixing up the church. We built a crude frame about 5 feet wide and centered it at the front of the church. In the middle of the frame, we made a tall window for the preacher to stand behind. Then we covered the entire frame solid with spruce pine branches, leaving only the space where the preacher would be. Around the church, we had placed ferns and other evergreen arrangements, as well as all the wildflowers we could find. We even picked the chapel house flower garden clean. It was beautiful. We finished a little before noon, giving us just enough time to change into our church clothes before the wedding. Miss Martson played the wedding march, and the couple walked down the aisle and stood before the preacher, who was behind the decorated window. It seemed to me like they were walking up to the side of the preacher's house, and he leaned out his window to marry them. Mary wore a pretty homemade dress. It was white and long, but there was no veil. It was not customary for the people up here to exchange rings. They did not have the money, nor did they get into town much. Mrs. Henderson gave Carl a necklace to give Mary, and Mary gave Carl something that she had. After the wedding, there was an infare at the chapel house. Before we ate, we played a game called musical paper. We had torn pages out of a Sears Roebuck catalog and put them on the floor. I'd always thought that maybe we should have called the game Mail Order Bride. Someone would beat on a pan, just like we did playing musical chairs when we were little. When the music stopped, the person who wasn't standing on a paper was out. Each time you would take up a paper, it was always funny when 2 people were going around the last piece of paper. Many times they would end up on their backsides on the floor, but the people enjoyed playing it. Out on the porch, we had placed a big table for the food that was almost as long as the porch, which went all the way across the front of the house. There was everything imaginable on that table. We had baked cakes and pies, and of course, best of all was her special wedding cake. To decorate the cake, they had beaten up egg whites until they were stiff and put sugar in it, like you would to make a meringue. They had made stiff peaks around the cake and placed red cinnamon candy berries on each one. Never had there been a prettier cake in these parts. The guests brought food for the main meal. They were all kinds of beans, green beans, and shab beans, as well as potatoes, cornbread, biscuits, gingerbread, and meats. The food the guests brought wasn't fancy like the mission food, but for sure, no one went hungry. I don't remember seeing any more church weddings until Preacher McKinney came to be the preacher at our church, and I went to all of his weddings. Christmas, 1926. Right along with the Christmas party on Christmas Eve and the Christmas program on Christmas Day, our Christmas Eve after party had really become a family and community tradition. The day before Christmas Eve in 1926, Daffy Turner came down to my house to help us prepare for our after party and to spend the night with me. We had the best time making molasses popcorn balls and planning what games and things we wanted to do at the after party. One thing we decided to do was spice up the popcorn balls. So we poured a whole big bag of those spicy cinnamon Red Hots, the same kind we had used to decorate Mary Ellison's wedding cake, into the molasses syrup and melted them. As usual, we had a house full of people at the party. Daffy was dating Ben, so he was there along with all of our other friends and my family. Daffy and I encouraged everyone to try our molasses popcorn balls, like we were so proud of making them. Those molasses balls were so hot that no one could eat them. Of course, Daffy and I had to pretend that we thought they were fine and ate several. We sat up playing paper dolls until midnight. Paper dolls were very popular at that time, even with the older girls, and we could get them at the mission. Then we played checkers and dominoes and old maids while we dared each other to eat more and more candy, molasses balls, and cake until we were all so sick. Not exactly physically sick, but very close to losing it all. We had eaten so much that we couldn't stand even the thought of food, especially anything sweet. About daylight, I was feeling particularly bad. Daffy and I didn't even want to see food, let alone eat it. Velma and Desmer knew how we felt and took advantage of the chance to tease us. They would offer us a big piece of cake or some other sweet. Oh, just the thought of it would make me sick. They would eat in front of us, taking big bites and letting the food show as they chewed it. Ben had not eaten as much as us, so it didn't bother him. Even Daffy was in better shape than I was. Miss Martson's death. Only a week or so after my 16th birthday, I learned that Miss Martson needed surgery. I was staying at the mission with Mrs. Henderson in February of 1927 when Miss Martson went into the Knoxville General Hospital to have a tumor removed. She never came back. That was one of the worst times for me. I had never thought of having to do without her. After Miss Martson died, everything changed. Mixed in with all of my grief were so many questions. What would the mission be like without Miss Martson? Would there even be a mission? Mrs. Henderson had always been more of a helper or an assistant. She would never be able to manage the mission and the school. Would someone be sent to take Miss Martson's place? What would happen to the school? To the families who depended on the mission? What of the sick, the needy? How could we go on? Next to my family, the mission had been my life, and I just couldn't imagine going on without it. You see, to me, it wasn't just Miss Martson I had lost, it was the mission too, at least as I had always known it. It was almost more than I could handle. From the time I was little, I had thought about the mission and chapel people and wondered what it would be like here if they had never come to help our community. What would my life have been like? I had no idea. Without the mission, there would not have been a real church and all those wonderful socials and Christmas programs. There had not been a preacher living at the mission for some time, but the Presbyterian church would send young preachers out to the chapel to preach. We wouldn't have had a school where the teachers sincerely loved us and cared about us and our families. Mrs. Henderson took care of the people in the community as she had before, but it was not the same, and the mission school never reopened after Miss Martson left. The parents who wanted their children to continue with their educations sent them down to Sand Hill. Even though I had not been able to attend classes, I had been keeping up with my subjects. I was 17 years old and in the 8th grade. I stayed at home and did the work so my sisters could go to Sand Hill. I guess you could say I was a dropout. As it turned out, Miss Martson had put so much of herself into me, and even though I missed her something awful, through my memories of her, I always felt as though she was with me. At times, especially when I felt discouraged or was almost ready to give up, I could almost hear her say, "You can become anything you want to be, and with God's help, you can do anything you set your heart to do if you're willing to work for it." Or I would just think about where she showed me in Jeremiah that God had a plan for my life and it was to be a good plan. Those words, as well as many others she spoke or read to me, were like a key that opened up the door of my heart and my future. They caused me to have hope and to dream. I've always tried to pass that hope and encouragement on to all my students and the people of my community, and I hope that they have passed it on to their children. My work kept me busy, and most nights I would stay in the chapel house with Mrs. Henderson. When the weather got a little warmer and the trees were beginning to bud, I would go up to the top of the mountain behind the mission almost every day. Everything was coming back to life after the cold winter. I had a favorite spot where I would sit and think about the mission and Miss Martson. It was beginning to look like no one would be coming to take her place, and I had no idea how long the mission could survive without someone. I missed her so much. She had just been everything to me, you know. I didn't want to lose the mission, too. It was one of those times up on the mountain that I knew, somehow, I had to get my education and come back here to be a mission worker. I could take care of the people. It seemed like I'd always been taking care of someone around the community. I could do it. I just knew it. I could feel it deep down inside of me, and just like Miss Martson had always told me, I would work hard and never give up. That was the day I made a bargain with God. Sitting up on the mountain, I looked right up at God and said, "If you will make it possible for me to get a scholarship and go off to school, I promise that I will come back here and be a mission worker and take care of my people." And I meant it, and I never once doubted that's just what would be. Oh, there were times when I didn't know how it would, but from that moment on, I never doubted that it was God's purpose for my life. Sand Hill School. The Sand Hill School and the Mount Zion Baptist Church shared the same small log building. It sat right where our church is located now, except its door faced the cemetery. The desk seats had long church-like benches, and each desk held 2 students. When I was little, I can remember going to a few funerals at Mount Zion Church. Some of the other smaller children and I sat on top of the desk because if we sat down behind them in the church seats, we couldn't see the preacher. The students were all ages and all grades up through the 8th. The teacher did not have a desk or even a chair. He sat on a wooden box at the front of the schoolroom. When it was time to teach a certain class, like maybe arithmetic, all the students in that class would come up to the front of the room and sit on the floor in front of the teacher's box. Some might sit in the empty desk at the front of the room if there were any. Every afternoon, when I would finish my work early enough, I'd go to the school to be with my sisters and the other kids. Back then, anyone could visit Sand Hill and sit in on the classes. I came more just to be there than anything. I never learned anything new, but there was something about being in a school that made me feel good, complete. One day when I was sitting there, something happened that changed my whole life and made me even more determined to get my education and return to help my people. but I doubt seriously that the teacher had any idea that I was even there that day. Well, on that particular afternoon, when I walked into the school, the teacher had the older students up front and was teaching them geography. He was sitting on the front side of his wooden box, rocking back and forth, just a-teaching away. He never did seem quite right to me. I just didn't have much use for him at all. The rest of the students were sitting at their desk, working on their lessons. If they were done, they could play what the teacher called deaf and dumb games. That meant he didn't want to hear any talking or noise. If he did, someone was likely going to get a whooping. I sat down in the back of the room by this little boy named Ernest. He had brought a grasshopper in from recess so he could play a deaf and dumb game of horsey. He tore off the grasshopper's back legs and handed me one of his pencils so I could play horsey with him. To win, you had to get your horsey to cross over the line that had been carved down the middle of the desktop to separate the two students' areas. You could only use your pencil or a little stick to guide your horsey over that line or to keep it from going off the ends of the desk. The other person used their pencil and tried to keep the horsey from crossing over the line. After we'd been playing horsey for a while, we just heard the awfulest commotion up at the front of the room. The geography class was just a-rolling around in the floor and a-laughing. Then we saw the teacher. There he was with his tail end stuck in that box and his hands and his feet sticking up in the air. Well, of course, it took us a while to get our minds back on our game, and just about the time I thought I was going to win the game, there went that noise again. The teacher had fallen in the box again with his hands and feet sticking up in the air. Now all the students were laughing and almost completely out of control. By this time, I was certain he was drunk. I'd heard one of the men say that he drank with him sometimes. I thought that was something awful, a teacher who would get drunk at school. I decided right then and there that somehow I would get my education and come back here to be a teacher. I looked over at Ernest and said, "I know I could stay on top of that box." Of course, he didn't know what I was talking about, but I had made my mind up. I might not be the best teacher, but I for sure wouldn't be falling down in some old wooden box. Stop right there. Oh, Opal. Don't you just love her? Absolutely love Opal. I just love her. Love her to death, even though I never knew her. I just love her. Now, this part that we read today, in the beginning, she's talking again about the weddings. You'll remember some of those. She was making reference to some of the things that we've already read in the previous readings where they used to pretend to have weddings. And she says, again, explains to us that in that time, in that area, weddings were just not something that was commonplace. People would, she called it slipping off. That's what Pap and Granny did. They slipped off and got married and then had to come home and tell Granny's parents that they got married. But it was such a different time, and there just wasn't weddings like there is today. You think about how much people spend, the average wedding. You've heard all those things. Maybe you've had to give someone a wedding, or maybe you had a wedding, a really one that's really expensive like they do today. I mean, they even have wedding planners, and you can see why when if you have to put all those little pieces together and it just becomes this whole production. But Opal's really talking about that. And then she's talking about the ones that she remembers every wedding. She just really loved the weddings. Even after they did start having them in the churches, she remembers those too. And the chapel, though, when they give the one wedding, they did make it, they did kind of go all out. Not like they do today, but still, for that time, they went all out. And she talks about how they decorated the whole place, and they made like a wall at the front. Wouldn't you have liked to have seen that with spruce branches? Oh, that would have been it would have smelled so good, but it would have been so pretty. But then made like a little window for the pastor for the preacher to actually do the marrying. They had ferns and flowers, wildflowers, and all that. And I wish I could have seen that. She says it was so beautiful. I do like thinking about how, today, of course, if you have a big wedding or you have a small wedding, you have flowers and things like that. And, even for Mother's Day, I got Katie to, or not for Mother's Day, for Matt's birthday, got Katie to come out and get a little bouquet. Right now I have a bouquet of gladolias in my kitchen. So it's amazing that we all still enjoy that nature, what nature gives us. Sometimes it could just be like a spruce, like a branch off a spruce tree, and it just bringing the nature inside just really does something for your spirit back then and still today. So I loved that, how they decorated with that. And then all the food they had sounded really, really good too to me, all those beans and the cornbread and stuff like that. And the cake they made sounded extremely beautiful, how they had put it in each little egg white meringue, really little peak. They'd put one of the red hot candies. That sounded so, so pretty. So you can just imagine in those days that would have been really big. I mean, the whole place, everybody would have been talking about that. And there's probably people that wanted to come to the wedding just to see all that and not really care much about the couple, or maybe didn't know them very well. So you can imagine that would have been a really big deal, and see why it stuck out in Opal's minds for sure. Then she tells again, we've already read about before, her telling about how that in her family it was this tradition on Christmas Eve. They had their program there at the mission, but then they had an after party at her house, and they would stay up all night, and the mother and them would cook all this food, and people would come. So she's already told us about that. So she's just telling us about it for that year, and that her and her friend, they put the red hots. It makes you wonder, like, was that the first time everybody knew about red hots and everybody just went crazy over them? But anyway, they put them in the popcorn balls, and they got them way too hot. I like a little bit of that cinnamon-y kind of hot flavor of a red hot, but I don't like hot stuff all that much, so I wouldn't want them in my popcorn balls for sure. And if I'd ate that cake, I probably would have picked mine out and just ate the icing too. But then she talks about some of the stuff they did that night. They made up they played different games and all that, but I love that she says they played paper dolls, how that was, even the older girls would play paper dolls. So I had a few paper dolls when I was young. Granny bought them for me. I don't remember where they come from. Maybe sometime you'd get a magazine or something, and it would have a little insert of paper dolls in it. And I played with them some. I didn't play with them as much, though, as I did my regular dolls. But, you'd fold the little clothes, like try to fold them over the shoulders. Maybe that's their dress or whatever they were wearing. So interesting, though, that was really like the big thing to do at that time, and that even the older girls would play. And then really sad, Miss Martson dies real suddenly. She had a tumor, and she went in and just didn't ever get to come back home. So you can see here in Opal's voice here how sad she was. Miss Martson had just meant so much to her and had influenced her, and she just didn't know what would happen, and she didn't know what would happen to the mission without her either, because she was the driving force behind it. So you can see how Opal's world was just kind of changed, forever, I guess, and also really quickly, just she didn't even expect it. She thought she would always have Miss Martson. She probably thought she'd always have Miss Martson, until she was grown and maybe married of her own, or off on, if she become a teacher or whatever, she'd always have Miss Martson to kind of encourage her and advise her. But then she died, so just left a tremendous hole in Opal's life. But I thought it's really interesting how she can kind of hear of the grief and how she didn't know what to do. But then gradually, as her grief kind of subsided a little bit, what she realized was Miss Martson was she could still hear her in her head. She was still, all that stuff she'd told Opal and taught her was still here. And that is so true. If you have someone that influences you, the influence they have doesn't just die with them when they die. Of course, I hear Pap all the time in my head. I hear things he told me, I hear him. There's other people, teachers or friends or whoever, that sometimes I think about wise things they told me, and how they're still influencing me all these years later. Certainly teachers, like Opal's talking about there with Miss Martson. And then she talks about, once she realized that, and she decided she wanted to do something, and she kind of made that deal with God that she wanted to, if he would let her get a scholarship and let her become a teacher, she would come back and teach her people. She really felt she loved her community, and she really wanted them all to do well, and she wanted to be able to broaden their horizons and teach them about like the daily, sanitary and things like that. I think she really had a heart for her community, her people, she called them. She really, really loved them. And amazing, once she had that hope, isn't hope wonderful? What would we do without hope? I mean, if there was no hope, how would we go on? Of course, as a believer, I think, my hope comes from the good Lord. I think Opal thought that too. But without hope, I mean, there's just nothing. And that's what she discovered. She had hope. She could do this. She'd already been taking care of people, and she'd already been working hard. And so she could do this if God would let her, if he was willing to help her, she could do it. She could for sure do it. So I love that part of just her coming to realize that Miss Martson was still with her, all the things that she had taught her, and then that she had the hope to go on. It is kind of sad there, she says, about herself, but again, Opal is so selfless. Previously we read how she quit school so that Maggie and Burl could go off to scholarship, when they got their scholarship, and she stayed home and done their work. Well, now that this happens and her little sisters want to go to school, she stays home so they can go to school. So she stays home again so that she can do the work, and so they can go. But then in that part, she kind of calls herself a dropout. She was a dropout in one way. I would say more of a servant, if you will, to her siblings. She sacrificed what she dearly loved for them. She sacrificed for the older two and for the younger ones too. So I don't really think of her as a dropout, but she's saying that about herself. But remember, she's kept up with her studies this whole time. She kept reading, she kept studying, she kept going to class when she could with Miss Martson. So she's certainly not, she's kind of being down on herself a little bit there. So, and then she gets the very last part, she gets where they're going to school. She'd go down there anytime she wanted to and just check in, kind of. And so that day that she goes, again, just really, the story that she shared really stilled her faith and her desire that she was going to go away and she's going to become a teacher and she's going to come back and do it the right way. She was going to be a good teacher. Now, the little game she's playing with Ernest, Horsey, sounds kind of mean to me. I've always loved grasshoppers, though. I really love grasshoppers, and I wouldn't want to tear their little legs off and play any kind of game like that, but that's just how kids were, and kids are today, too, like that. Don't think anything about it. Anyway, but so her and Ernest are playing the game, and then hear that big commotion, and the first time you could say, well, maybe the teacher just accidentally slipped somehow and fell in the box. But the second time, I think Opal was probably right. He probably was drunk, and he didn't. And maybe that's why he was moving around when she first got there on the box. So maybe that was why. But oh my goodness, yeah, thinking about a drunk teacher, that's not good at all. So that just again makes Opal even more sure. It kind of solidifies her plan is that she's going to become a teacher and she's going to come back and do it the right way. I just love Opal. I wish I could have met her. I wish I could have known her the way Barbara got to know her. But I'm so thankful that Barbara did know her so that she got to write this wonderful book for all of us to enjoy. I hope you enjoyed this part of Opal's story. Hope you'll leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you. And as always, I hope you'll drop back by next Friday.